So you want to become a manga reader? Hi, welcome back to my channel, Manga Hoarder. My name is Laura, and today I'm doing a weird video. I think it's weird. It is how to get into manga. So this is basically my tips on how to become a manga reader and how to kind of grow an obsession to manga. Maybe not quite to my level of obsession, but certainly how to get into it. I know that manga is becoming more and more visible. That certainly is sort of I see it a lot, at least in BookTube, where people are saying they're going to try manga out for the first time in 2019. I've watched a lot of, New Year's resolution videos, and I just wanted to encourage people to try manga. And so this isn't necessarily going to be for the people who are already subscribed to me. I suspect you're subscribed to me because you're already into manga. So this is for people who are need some encouragement to get into it, or need to kind of know a place to start, and just want some kind of tips. So it is a little bit of a weird video, but it is just sort of something that I wanted to talk about. And I have a whole bunch of videos that I wanted to kind of follow after this video, but I really wanted to have a good starting video. So this is really how to get into it, and then we can talk in later videos about, now that you're into it, this is what you need to do. So I just thought that this would be a fun video to do. Certainly if you're already into manga or into some other thing, you can let me know any other tips that you might have about how to really get involved in manga, or how to really get sort of obsessed or interested in it. That would definitely be interesting to me. So a little background about me. I am definitely into manga. Manga is my thing, and it has been my thing since about 2003 when I picked up Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind for the first time. That was a huge turning point in my hobbies. But previous to that, I was into anime, so I got into anime back in about 1994, 1995. Basically with Sailor Moon when it started airing on television, although I was watching primarily animated cartoons up to that point, or anime particularly up to that point. Those were just the cartoons that appealed to me. I just didn't know what it was sort of until Sailor Moon kind of really brought all of that information to me. Before that, I was into My Little Pony. I had a very substantial collection. I had several thousand, actually. That was right before the whole Brony kick came out. So when the G3 Friendship is Magic movie came out, that was basically when my collection of ponies stopped, and I ended up selling a good portion of those off. Before that, I was obsessed with country music. Seems really weird to me, but when I was in high school, that was a big thing, and I had a friend that we would go to lots of concerts and stuff together. I was very much into rodeo, which kind of was a spin-off from the country music thing. Very strange thing, but we do live sort of in what is known as Cowtown, so there is sort of a cowboy presence in our city. When you walk down the street, there's a lot of statues of, indigenous leaders, as well as cowboys and horses and stuff. That's just a present part of where I live. When I was a bit younger, I was definitely obsessed with Wayne Gretzky. That's just he was just a topic all on his own, and that lasted until until he got married. Actually, I broke my heart as a small child. And up till then, I was obsessed with hockey, obviously, but I also had a huge obsession with dinosaurs. And so I think even in like my grade 12 yearbook, there's always that page on your graduating yearbook. I'm assuming some people have that. We had a very small school, so ours was very cozy. And the write-up for mine was Laura will be remembered for, and it's just a list of all of my obsessions up until Sailor Moon. And so it's what I've been known for. And so I know about getting obsessed with things. I know about getting into things, and sort of how to become obsessed with things. Not that that's necessarily a behavior that you want, but I certainly know how to really get invested in something and really quickly. And so if that is something that you're interested in doing, like getting involved in manga in particular, but really any sort of hobby or interest, then these are maybe some tips for you. Maybe, if that's something you want to do. So my first tip is to just read comics in general. If you are not already a reader of comics, it is going to be a lot harder for you to become a reader of manga. I'm not saying that you can't do it. Certainly, it's totally fine. Like, start anywhere you want, read whatever you want, and that's totally okay. But if you are already reading comics, then you already have a sense of how to read comics. It is different than reading prose. You do have to combine the text that's going on in the background, as well as the text that's going on in the foreground, as well as all of the action. And it's kind of like, I would say, watching foreign films with subtitles. So you have to pay attention to both the action that's going on, the intonation of the way that someone is speaking, as well as reading the text. And so that's sort of like what reading comics is like. It is like watching foreign films. So you have to put all of these pieces together in order to form the story in your mind. And if you are already prepared, or already practiced at putting all of those pieces together, it'll be a whole lot easier when you want to get into manga, because the one sort of difference about manga to any other comics that you're going to read is that they are now being translated in the Japanese reading order, which means that they're being read from right to left. So you can see here that when you are reading a manga, that the jacket of the book actually opens on the other side, which is the Japanese reading direction. When manga were early being published in English, they were actually being flipped, or flopped, I think is what we were calling them, and they were reading in the English reading order, but it was distorting the art and distorting the way that you would actually read the panels, and so fans agreed, and basically the publishers soon followed, that the best way to translate was to read it in Japanese reading order. And so most of the publications that you're going to get these days are going to be read in this direction. In addition to combining all of those parts of reading a graphic novel or reading a comic book together, you're also going to have to read it in the reverse order. So if you already have the how to read a comic book figured out, then you can add that one extra step of complexity to it, and it'll be a lot easier to transition into manga than it is going from reading prose or not reading at all into reading manga. There is a little bit of a disconnect there. But one thing that I will mention, that most popular manga are going to have something inside the back cover which will tell you not only that you're starting on the wrong side, but how to actually read all of the different panels and how to read the bubble. So it will kind of number it for you and kind of give you a sense of how to read it. Sort of the rule is you're going to read from the left side to the right side and top to bottom, and that is generally the kind of the order that you're going to follow. Sometimes it isn't as clear as all of that, so you definitely want to check out the reading guide if you're new to it, and just sort of get a sense of what you're supposed to do. But I would also recommend just knowing how to read comics in general. Number 2 is start early, and I think that if you're already an adult and you never read comics as a child, it's going to be very difficult for you to become a comic book reader. I've read many articles and many stats on sort of what you can expect from children as they age, and generally if children have read comic books as a child, then they've already kind of formed a relationship with comics. They already kind of understand what it is, and so going forward it's a lot easier for them and a lot more natural for them to be reading comics as an adult. Again, you certainly can start reading comics as an adult, but it will be more difficult for you, so you are going to have to put in more effort is really what it's going to be. So if you haven't read comics and you're coming into them and you're just like, I don't get this, it doesn't make sense to me, it might just be that you haven't developed that necessary skill as a child, and so you're going to have to develop it now as an adult. Tip number 3 is to pick titles that match genres that you're already interested in. I'm assuming that a lot of the people who are maybe interested in getting into reading manga have read something else or are readers of some other kind. So I would say if you are reading prose and you like fantasy as like that's your favorite genre, then I would say pick up fantasy in manga. Manga is as wide and diverse in what is available to you as any other genre or any other format of reading. So, you know, there is just as much in manga as you can find in prose fiction, or prose, period. You know, you can find nonfiction, you can find adult things, you can find historical and fantasy and slice of life and, you know, hard topics or silly topics. You can find comic strips, you can find really anything that you are interested in is available in manga. It's not necessarily all available in English, but it is certainly going to be available sometime. And you can probably find something that is closely related to something you already get. I think basically my tip for getting into manga is reading something you're comfortable with, and I would really recommend that if you're already comfortable with a historical topic, then read something that's historical. If you're already comfortable with reading, you know, sports stories about basketball players, then read sports stories about basketball players. Like, there is a manga that will match something that you're already interested in, and it will be a lot easier to kind of synthesize with what you're already doing. My next recommendation is to pick short series. It is really kind of desirable to pick up probably the most popular titles, but a lot of those most popular titles are going to be very long. And that's sort of one of the symptoms of being popular, is that they continue and they go on and on and on. So it is really difficult to read a whole story because manga is written in long arcs. Generally, one volume does not constitute one story. You usually have to read several volumes, and sometimes 20 volumes to get basically what the story is. So it's sort of like you're reading, every volume is sort of like a chapter to a novel, and it isn't until you get to the last chapter that you've read the entire novel. That's sort of how manga works. So you really do want to pick sort of shorter stories, just so that you can get a taste of it, but also so that you get a chance to actually read full stories and really understand what it is that you like about it. Again, it's totally okay if you want to jump right into reading, you know, One Piece or Naruto, go for it. They're fun stories, but they'll take you a long time to get to the end. But then, you know, going off from that, I would also say that picking popular titles are a really good idea. I would say, you know, like if it is a long series, pick ones that are very popular, that you hear people talking about and recommending all the time. Those are the ones that are going to be kind of really rewarding, because you're going to have a community of fans to also talk about that title with. And they're also, they made it that long for a reason, that they're already really fun to read. And so those are also really good titles to pick up sort of for first series usually. So I do recommend them as good titles, but if you actually do want to read a full story, they're probably not what I would pick first. Another thing that I would say is, particularly if you're a bit older, you might want to try reading to your age level. Manga is available to every age level. You can find anything from children's stories to the most pornographic stories. Like, there's everything in between. So, you know, I would pick something to your age level and to your interest. Unless, you know, you're an adult who likes to read YA, then, you know, certainly you have a lot more options available to you, because manga generally that's being pulled over is more prevalent in that kind of teenage range. And it is a really fun range to read in. But if you are sort of more inclined to read adult titles or more literary titles, those are available, and I would say I would focus on those maybe more than trying to read some of the more youthful stories, just because you do want to kind of match what your interests and your tastes are, and sometimes even for me it does get kind of tiring to constantly be reading about teenage high school romantic dramas. You know, I get pretty tired of it. I haven't been in high school in over 20 years. Like, it's a long time ago. I don't really I like some of those stories, but I don't necessarily connect with them at all anymore, and so there's a lot of that, and for that to like constantly appear in stories, you know, I get tired of it, and so it is nice to mix in some of these titles that were actually marketed to me. The way that manga is marketed is to basically to gender and also to age range, and so you can kind of pick things based on where you think you fit and find titles that way, and I think that that's actually a good way to find really good stories that would really suit you by looking within the demographic. My next tip is to start with anime. I think a lot of us got into manga because we were already watching anime. I certainly got interested in anime in the mid-90s thanks to Sailor Moon, and I got really heavily involved in watching anime, collecting anime. My anime collection is now being dwarfed by my manga collection, but I had a very substantial collection. I watched a ton of it, and that's pretty much all I did was watch anime. It's easier to consume. You know, you don't have to do the work of reading all the panels. You do have to do the work if you're watching subtitles to read the subtitles, but it is sort of a different experience because it is an interpretation of manga. It's the way that someone has viewed the manga and has turned it into a story, and so you don't have to do the interpreting yourself, or interpreting. And because manga is generally the source material for anime, you get all of the same things in anime. You know, you get the same stories, you get the same symbols, you get the same character design, and you get a sense of how things are pronounced, which is really beneficial for when you want to transition into manga, because that's not going to be there for you, but some of those Japanese words will be retained in manga. So it is nice to be able to actually know how to pronounce things. So I think that it's just a really natural and fluid transmission from anime into manga. You know, they are so closely related. I think pretty much anyone who you would watch on here, on YouTube in particular, are going to talk about anime and manga. I don't watch a whole lot of anime anymore, even though I was so heavily involved in it before, because I just don't feel like I have the time, because I am reading manga and I would rather read manga. But it is a good way it's a good entry into manga, and certainly a lot of people retain that interest in anime as well, which is great. I think it's wonderful, but I am very much interested in manga. Now, my next tip is to read the series in order. I think a lot, particularly if you're going to like secondhand stores or you're going to the library or something, it might be tempting to try a manga out by picking up volume 5 because that's the only thing that's on the shelf. But manga, because they are long story arcs, they need to be read in order. They're very sort of select few titles that can be read in out of order, so like titles that are self-contained, short stories. Those are the kind of things that can be read individually, and there aren't that many. I would say the majority of what you're going to get in manga are going to be these long overarching stories, and you miss one volume, you've missed the story. So it is really important to actually start from volume 1 and to progress throughout the series, to read every single volume in a series. So that's a recommendation, just so that you aren't starting out confused. It is a little bit easier, I think, in different types of comic traditions to be able to pick up any volume, because the stories sort of work maybe more in a situational comedy way where you have sort of a problem and it's solved by the end of the volume. That's not how manga works. So you definitely want to start at volume 1. Sort of going off from that, my next tip is to read 3 volumes before you judge it. I think that's sort of become the standard for most manga readers, is that 3 volumes will tell you if a story is good. I think most of the time, because manga are published in magazines before they are produced in book form or tankobon, they are sort of selling themselves. So those first few volumes are them trying the story out. They're trying to see what their audience is interested in. They are trying to decide what direction they need to go in, and it's sort of at that 3rd volume, particularly for longer series, where the story gets sort of decided and solidified. And so until you get there, you can't really make a good judgment on whether or not that story is worth reading. So that does make things a little bit difficult, and it's one of the reasons why I would say stick to shorter series, because that rule doesn't necessarily apply for the shorter series, but it certainly applies for things like Naruto and One Piece and Bleach and Magi and My Hero Academia. The long series really don't become the thing that they're supposed to become until volume 3. So you do need to give it a little bit of time before you can kind of make a judgment. My next tip is to find a community. I think particularly for a lot of my interests, I wouldn't have become interested in those things if I didn't have friends who were also interested in those things. It is a lot easier to retain your interest in something, your passion for something, your focus on something, if you have someone to talk to about it. So that even goes for manga. I've been very fortunate that I live with someone who's as passionate about manga as I am. And so we can talk about it at any time of the day or night, and we do, and it's really great. But I think that if I didn't have that, I don't know how strong my passion would be, or how large my collection would be. I certainly wouldn't have invested maybe quite as much time. I think I would always have an interest in it, but I don't think it would be quite as focused for quite as long, because we have been collecting our manga together since the beginning, so that's really helped. I had friends that I was collecting My Little Pony with, but we were quite distant, and then that friendship was sort of broken, or like there was a distance between us, and so we didn't see each other very often, and my interest in My Little Ponies kind of waned. Not only, like, there was other reasons as well, but if you don't have that constant connection with people, it kind of helps you lose focus, or it's harder to keep the focus on something you're interested in. Was also the fact that manga was also coming into my house and I couldn't afford two hobbies, but that's another thing. Same went with, country music. I was really into country music, and, there was a big part of why I didn't like it anymore was because I stopped actually liking the writing, the songs. I thought that they were just garbage, but I also didn't have anyone to talk to about it anymore, and so, I did have a lot of friends who were into it in high school, but I didn't after that. There was nobody who was listening to it, so I actually moved on to classical music, which was a weird transition, which is what I listen to classical music and J-pop now. Those are my two things that I listen to, but I don't have a community to talk to about it, so it's not something that I'm like super passionate about. It's just something that I do. Yeah, so I definitely would say find a community. There's lots of communities online. Certainly YouTube is a good place to start, but there's also lots of forums. You can certainly, if you're young enough, you're still in school, you might be fortunate enough to find some sort of anime or manga club at your school. That certainly did not exist when I was in school, so I'm jealous of all of you who get to do that. And there's different kind of local things that you could probably do, but there's also online things that you could do. Just get involved a little bit, make some friends. It really helps. They'll also sort of help guide you in reading what to read next. Another tip that is very much how I get into something is to learn as much as I can. And basically when I feel like my knowledge is filled, then I can move on to the next thing. And that's how a lot of my smaller interests have happened. My small hobbies have happened. When I got interested in, like, even as a child, I got interested in hockey. I went to the library and I checked out every single book that I could find on hockey. I read all about rules of hockey. I read all the biographies I could about hockey. I learned everything that I could about hockey. That sort of sustained my obsession, was that I was also learning so much. And so when you learn a lot, it's something that you know about, and so then when you see other things happening, you can process it a lot easier, a lot better, and it just becomes your interest. Knowing about something is becoming your interest. You might even find that about the kind of work you do. If someone talks about something related to something you do at work, you're automatically interested in it because you already have a knowledge. So it's about building the knowledge right off. And the same was true for anime. When I discovered that anime was, Japanimation at the time was from Japan, I went to my library and I read everything I could about Japan. I didn't read big textbooks, but I read a lot of encyclopedias and things like that about Japan, trying to figure out what this place was like and trying to put those two things together. There weren't a lot of books about anime, so there wasn't a lot for me to look at, and there wasn't a lot of internet connection back then, so it was a little bit rough to do that kind of investigation, but that's the first thing that I do. As soon as I'm interested in something, I go and figure it out, I go and find it out, and now you've got things like Wikipedia, so you can immediately start learning about something, which is amazing. My next tip is to read it cheap. there's a lot of ways that you can read manga cheaply, and a lot of those include going to your public library. Hopefully they have them. If they don't, I would really recommending titles to them, particularly short series. You're not necessarily going to get everything, but the more that they hear that people want to read manga in their community, the more likely that they're going to start opening their budget for manga. So this is how you get manga into your collection. Not only that, but you have to start reading it, because if they don't see checkout stats, if they don't see that this is a popular format, they're not going to keep investing in it. So you have to keep that going. That's more of a tip for people who want to start kind of manga in their community, but it is really how kind of libraries work. So for reading, your library might have some. If they don't have some, they might have an interlibrary loan service. That's usually where they will borrow books from other libraries. Some library services will require you to pay for that service, which may or may not be cheap. It might cost you about $1 to borrow a book, or it might cost you a lot more. You'd really have to look into it. Some of those library services will require you to only read like academic texts and won't include things like comics, but some of them will be free, and so it's really to your advantage to go and check out and see if that's a thing that your library offers. Because even if they don't have it, they might be willing to actually import and borrow from other library systems, which is sort of an amazing thing, that there's this community of library borrowing that you don't know that you could take advantage of. Another way, of course, is to read online. Again, the library might have some online services like Hoopla or Overdrive where they can supply digital copies of manga to you. And then you can go further and you can go on to publisher websites like Viz and Kodansha. They actually provide some free chapters. They might provide even more depending on kind of what they're promoting at the time, but at the very least you should be able to preview series before you buy, which is a really great way to not accidentally buy something you maybe aren't going to like. If you can tell immediately what that story is going to be like, you can kind of avoid maybe some things that you might not be into. There certainly are some genres that I don't like, and I might not notice until those first couple of chapters what I'm getting into. So that's a really good way to avoid accidentally buying something you don't like. A lot of secondhand stores sell manga. You can go to like library sales that might happen in your city, or there are things like different digital apps. I think Crunchyroll might have free manga. I've never actually tried them, but I certainly know that Viz has a Shonen Jump app, which has I think a good portion of their Shonen Jump titles for a very nominal fee. So there's lots of ways that you can get a lot of manga for very cheap. Yeah, so I know that this is not necessarily going to be a tip that will work for everyone. Certainly not every country has equal access to things. But, if you are living in North America, you have you are very close to a lot of the publishing, and so you are going to have a lot better access to a lot of these free resources or cheap resources, and I would say really to take advantage of your good fortune by being where you are. And then sort of that brings me on to my last tip, which I've already kind of mentioned, and that was to try before you buy. So there are lots of ways that you could try manga before you buy it, using those resources to not spend a lot of money, or just to buy the first volume and try it out before you decide whether or not you're going to keep going with it. I think it does get really, it does look like a good idea to maybe sometimes go all in and buy an entire series all at once, and sometimes that's a very economical way to do it, but if you're just getting into manga, you really don't know what your tastes are yet, and it is very expensive to collect manga or to buy manga. So I would say go slow, try things before you kind of get into them, and there's lots of different ways that you can do that. Hopefully you'll have a community around you so that you'll have people maybe you could borrow from. Hopefully you'll have free resources like your library, and hopefully we can get some, or hopefully there'll be more kind of publishers who get into more of this sort of digital access like viz as. I know that might even be a limited service to certain areas, so I don't know how available those kinds of access are to everybody, but hopefully that just becomes more available. I would love it if manga was available to everyone. I know that there's pockets of availability here and there, but it's just not available to everyone, which is really disappointing because it's something that I love so much and I think everyone should have access to. But there are other things to read too, and there are other comic books to read, and I really would urge you to be reading in general, so that's sort of my other kind of go-to, I guess. And then the last tip is to read some things that maybe other people have recommended. Find titles that others recommend that are good for beginners. I certainly have a video. I know other people have posted videos of good titles for beginners to try out. There's a lot that are repeated in those videos that are really good starting points for different various reasons, but there's a lot of titles that you could be interested in. And if you're looking for titles to read, I would certainly be happy to, recommend titles, but tell me what kinds of things you already like to read, because when you just say, I'm interested in reading manga, what should I read? I have thousands of manga, and I would recommend most of them. But if I knew what you like to read, maybe what your favorite book is or why you like that favorite book, I can give you something that maybe you'd be a little bit more interested in reading, or at least I think you might want to try. And barring that, you should read Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, because it's the best thing ever. So apart from that, I think that's it for today. If you have any tips yourself, I would love to hear them down below about how to get sort of hooked on something, or how to get really into a hobby. I would love to hear that. And if you're already into manga already, I would really love to get recommendations for new readers. So if you have any recommendations of a manga that a new reader absolutely must read that will really get them hooked on manga, I would love to see those down below. That would really help everyone out. Anyway, I think that's it for me today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.